Hello again. In this lesson, we'll focus on the essentials about teaching pronunciation. Let's begin by exploring some thoughts about teaching pronunciation. Normally, we wonder about the importance of pronunciation for language learning and teaching. And we also wonder sometimes about the difference between teaching phonetics and phonology versus teaching pronunciation. And then, of course, as language teachers, we wonder what we should be able to know and do when we teach pronunciation. And we wonder about our priorities when teaching pronunciation. And we wonder if we should teach individual sounds or allophones, suprasegmentals. And of course, the greatest and more important question is, what's the best way to teach pronunciation? Of course, there are many equally valid answers to these questions. And in this lesson, we will explore some of the basic principles for teaching pronunciation, and we will begin by showing you the descriptors of the Common European Framework for Phonological Competence that were presented in 2018. In general terms, we can see that the most important thing at the basic level are the individual sounds, whereas when we move towards the C2 level, we can see that there's a wider array of elements, including prosodic features. So that is basically that when we're teaching beginning students, we will focus on individual sounds, and then later we will proceed to paying more attention to the suprasegmental aspects of pronunciation. A systematic framework for teaching pronunciation will include at least three main stages. First of all, the diagnostic stage, at which we will identify the learner's needs and will organize a syllabus. The second level is the teaching itself, in which we will focus first of all on individual sounds and then on the suprasegmental aspects of pronunciation. So for both of these elements, we're going to focus first of all on the identification of the phonological features, and then we will proceed to the discrimination of similar elements, and finally we'll move on to the production stage, in which we'll have both controlled and free practice. The last level will include remediation, that is, that once we have taught, we will include in our teaching some strategies for self-correction and self-monitoring from the students themselves. Now, let's talk about how we can go on about teaching individual sounds and the allophones of the English language. We're going to be looking at three main important elements: the general problems that students have when pronouncing the sounds. We will also talk about some specific problems that Spanish speakers have. And finally, we will provide just a basic teaching toolkit so that we know what are the different ways in which we can teach these elements. So concerning the vowel sounds, the general problems that people have when learning English is the number of vowel sounds. In the case of Spanish, there are 5 vowel sounds, whereas in English there are 14 vowel sounds. So this is a first problem. The second problem is the distinction between tense and lax vowels, because in Spanish there are only lax vowels. Another element that is going to be difficult concerns the central vowels, because these ones, since Spanish is a syllable time language, all of the syllables take the same time to be pronounced, and therefore there is no vowel reduction. In other words, there are no central vowels. Something specific for Spanish speakers that we need to take into account, of course, are the distinctions between the sounds E versus E, and the sound E versus U, and of course the distinction between the sound E and the sound E, and all of these sounds that can be very confusing for learners: A versus O versus O versus E. So all of these sounds are going to pose problems to the learners, and we need to focus on them when we teach pronunciation. These are some materials and activities that we can use for the identification and discrimination stages of the lesson. First of all, we can use materials such as picture and sound charts. We could use color charts as the ones that are used in the silent way. We could also use visual aids. Some of them could be exaggerating articulation so that the students know how they are going to pronounce the sounds. We could use SAMI diagrams that show the articulation of the sounds, or we can have students bring mirrors to class and look at themselves as they are producing the sounds. Some other elements, of course, that we could use are minimal pairs, which are very useful for the discrimination stage where they can compare and contrast different sounds. And finally, we can use some songs where the students can listen and identify the sounds that could be the focus of our lesson. Now, for the controlled and communicative practice stage of our lesson, we could use some other materials such as apps and videos, which are very interesting for the students. We could also use some minimal pair reading and listening exercises. There could be some sentences and dialogues for students to practice. And of course, songs are always very useful and interesting. And finally, there could be some games and communicative activities where students can apply the differences that they have learned in the controlled stage of the lesson. Let us now look at some examples of materials and activities that can be used at the identification stage of the lesson. First of all, we can use a picture and word chart in which we can illustrate all of the different vowel sounds of the English language. If you notice here, the advantage is that we don't need to teach the phonetic symbols, and the students can associate different words and pictures to each of the individual vowel sounds of the English language. A second option will be to use the color charts, and of course a disadvantage is that it may be difficult for some people to relate the colors to the sounds, but these materials have been proven to be useful in the silent way method. Now, the last option that we have is to help students identify the sounds by actually teaching the phonetic symbols. This is particularly useful for advanced adult learners or people who need to have a specialized knowledge in phonetics, such as yourselves, but it could probably not be very useful for children or other kinds of learners. Now, something important too is that a disadvantage of teaching the phonetic alphabet is that you cannot teach all of the phonetic alphabets, and the students are likely to encounter other symbols in other dictionaries, and they might find this a little bit confusing. Once our students have identified the sounds, we can move on to the discrimination stage of the lesson, and there are different activities and materials that we could use. First of all, we can use pictures of mirrors to help students discriminate between rounded and unrounded sounds, and they can discover the different positions of the lips when they produce different kinds of vowel sounds. So they will find out that some vowel sounds are rounded, such as the ones in ball and boat, that in some cases our mouth is wide open, such as when we pronounce the vowel sounds in the words box or son or girl, that in some cases our lips are pursed, such as when we pronounce the vowel sounds found in the words boot or book, that our lips will be spread when we pronounce words such as sheep or ship, and that also there is some spreading of the lips when we pronounce words such as cake or bed or bat. So these pictures or mirrors are very useful to teach the students the discrimination between rounded and unrounded sounds. If we have advanced learners or people with specialized knowledge, we could also use SAMI diagrams to illustrate features such as tongue height, as in the vowel in the word sheep, which is front high, or the high back vowel in the word boots, or the low back vowel that can be found in the word box. So all of these diagrams could be useful to illustrate tongue height, but then again we need to see if we can use it depending on the kind of students that we have and on the purposes of our teaching. Minimal pairs are very useful for the discrimination stage of the lesson. A minimal pair can be defined as a pair of words in which all of the sounds are the same except for one. So in this case we can focus on the distinction between the high lax vowel sound that we find in the word ship versus the high tense vowel sound that we find in the word sheep. So the students will know that the words on the left are pronounced as sin and mel and sit and bit and pill and it and this and fill and tin and bin and hell and tim and chip, whereas the words on the right will be pronounced as seen and meal and seat and beat and peel and eat and these and feel and teen and bean and heel and team and cheap. So again, the minimal pairs are very useful to show the discrimination between two different sounds. Let's now move on to the control and communicative practice stage of the lesson. Once the students have identified the sounds and work on the discrimination of similar sounds, we can give them some extra practice so that they can use the information that they have already acquired. This stage we can use again minimal pairs, but in this case with sentences, and the students can take turns pronouncing the words and circling the words that they hear. So in this case we can work on both comprehension and production of the sounds, but the practice is controlled. So this means that the students are focusing on specific pairs of sounds. In this case we're working on the distinction between lax and tense vowels. Another activity to provide control practice is playing bingo. Now this activity could be a little bit more challenging because we're going to create bingo cards as the one shown here with different distinctions of vowel sounds. And the students are going to take turns pronouncing the list of words while the others mark the word that they hear, and the winner will be the first students to find all of the words either diagonally across a row or vertically in a column. So this is a game that the students normally know, but the challenge is to pronounce the words correctly and then hear the words correctly so that they can identify and cross them out. So this is again another important and useful activity in which they will work with both comprehension and production of the sounds. Another very interesting and fun activity to help students to practice the sounds is playing categories. In this case, a target sound is going to be selected by the teacher, such as the vowel sound in the word box, and what students have to do is to look for words that contain that sound. The first student who finds all of the words in each of the categories is going to be the winner, and of course the students can take turns selecting different sounds, and then this will be a great opportunity for the teacher to provide feedback on some words that the students may be mispronouncing. So this is yet another activity that could be very useful for the control or free practice of the individual sounds, in this case the vowel sounds. So in this lesson we have outlined some basic principles for teaching pronunciation, and we have provided some examples of activities and materials that can be used for the identification, discrimination, and production stages of a lesson. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I will be seeing you next time.